This series of readings bring a close, of course, to the course and also the overview, and specifically in terms of a development in what I call stage 4 study of religion, which is represented by just generally two factions. One that is anti-phenomenological, as it goes against the kinds of things that have been represented in stage 3 type of religious studies, to one that is more politically minded. It's more conscientious of the fact of ideological leanings in scholarship. So we could dub that the anti-phenomenological development. And in the question, if you recall in your last final question, and we can get into this in greater detail, there's this fellow by the name of Russell McCutcheon that is listed there as an individual who is almost typical to pinpoint nowadays with regard to stage 4, much like Iliada is with regard to stage 3. There are many others like Russell McCutcheon who represent this anti-phenomenological backlash, which has taken over a lot of the theorizing that we've looked at, specifically the Foucauldian tinge of it, which has it in for Iliada, and any kind of form of, if you like, general descriptive religious reflection represented by the likes of the phenomenological school. So it's typically seen as a apolitical, self-authorizing scholarly discourse, which I call stage 4 because it is explicitly ideologically invested, that is, in terms of critique, especially drawing a strong distinction between the study of religion that smacks of anything theological and what is constituted by this group of individuals, these anti-phenomenologists, as anti-historical, anti-social scientific, anti-reductionist. But we have to be clear that this form of anti-phenomenology is not reductionist in that 19th century style of reductionism. But nonetheless, it believes that methodologically, reductionism is an important principle in the analysis of religion. Okay. I'm doing these broad characterizations here just so that you could wrap your head around the literature that we're looking at today. Okay, so this anti-phenomenological wing in stage 4 study of religion more or less protracts the gesture that we've been looking at in post-structuralist schools. Okay, so it takes over a lot of that thinking, but puts it in the context of religious studies, and it's often dubbed a new materialism in religious studies because it emphasizes the material conditions of religious behavior that scholars of religion study. But their main preoccupation is to exclude any type of thinking that smacks of theology in religious studies. So it continues that old narrative in religious studies, which made a concerted effort to close off any type of normative reflection in the study of religion. Russell McCutcheon represents this new materialistic backlash against phenomenology and theology as self-authorizing discourses that mean to self-authorize a class of scholarship. Okay, so that's the basis. Now, that current of thinking in religious studies has given rise to a lot of thinking now in that space of discussion that is opened up by the new materialist developments in religious studies, right? So Russell McCutcheon, there are some others like Robert Siegel, Bruce Lincoln, Gary Guess, and many others, Joseph Fitzpatrick. It's a big movement. And so what's happening now is that this has sparked theologians who are sympathetic to religious studies, that is, to working within a religious studies environment, to think about a new type of normative engagement in the study of religion that is not closed off to the normative elements of religious discourse. It seeks to recast itself, as it were, in the confines of religious studies without reiterating the partisan religious perspectives that any one particular theologian may represent, whether it's Christian, Buddhist, and so on, okay? So this is, if you want a term for it, maybe a kind of pluralizing theology along the lines that we saw with Barnes. But I would say that Barnes is more of a theologian working within a specific theological tradition. What is referred to now in this literature is a broader normative, philosophical, and theological engagement that is renewing the task of critiquing what they feel is an ideological orientation in people like McCutcheon. Specifically, that it too is part of the discourse of culture, which has its own belief set, which values its own value set. There are things that are valued by McCutcheon, for example, that all discourse on religion should be like historicist, should be naturalistic, and so on. Okay? So this is not a neutral perspective. This too has ideological orientation that's based on certain values that have emerged out of Western, liberal, democratic ways of thinking. So it comes from somewhere. It's not neutral. And so it really has no right to see itself above the fray of cultural productions, in judging cultural productions, right? People like McCutcheon want religion or want a normative engagement to be outside of academe because it's ideology without footnotes. So now this particular wing, represented by people like Devaney, Cooey, there are others that I could mention, Tyler Roberts, Carl Raschke, and even myself. We represent this current that is fully enmeshed in a stage 4 approach to the study of religion, but doesn't like to close doors on all discourses when it comes to the discussion of religious phenomena. There's this desire, and this, I'm speaking that we all have our differences. They're all specific, like Devaney and Cooey are more theological. Myself and Raschke and people like Tyler Roberts are more philosophical. But nonetheless, we feel that normative engagement should be part of religious studies and shouldn't be excluded from religious studies for the reasons that I think have been well argued by Devaney, Cooey, and even to a certain extent Strensky, although Strensky wouldn't share my perspective entirely, because you see Strensky, as I think you read, wants to exclude metaphysics from religious study. He doesn't feel that there's a place for it, but even the character of McCutcheon's form of metaphysics, which is anti-metaphysics, right? Am I being too is it a little much? The sense in which a naturalist discourse, which tends to be anti-metaphysical, is itself non-demonstrable. That is, it is a metaphysics. People like McCutcheon represent a new form of protectionism, right? You remember when Eliade came on the scene, he tried to say that phenomenology represents a new development that is based on the irreducible nature of religion. And everybody else who's analyzing religion is missing the essence of religion. Right? And so McCutcheon says, well, how convenient is that? He's formulating a concept of religion which is seen to be irreducible, which is seen to be beyond psychology, sociology, anthropology, and so forth. And it protects the nature of religion by calling it sui generis. There has been a backlash now against the critique of people like McCutcheon, who feel that he and others represent a new form of protectionism, namely a protectionism of their naturalistic historicist method, which will not allow theology to talk back. Theology and religion is only data, right? All we do is analyze, explain. But religion has no place. Religion in whatever form, whether you're talking about, the grassroots level of religiosity or even the academically high-minded forms of religious studies, it doesn't belong in academia. So this is often dubbed a new protectionism. And people like Devaney, Cooey, myself and others are against it for primarily philosophical reasons. That's the general background here. And Devaney is that individual who represents this new way of thinking about theology as a form of academic theology. Academic theology, which is different from what's traditionally dubbed systematic theology, namely thinking systematically the norms of a religious tradition. Both Devaney and Cooey are trying to imagine a broader theological, I like to call it an explicitly normative engagement of religious principles in the environment of academia. They're both stage 4 approaches to the study of religion. Okay. So this backlash against new materialism is not trying to go back to stage 3. It's saying the stage 4 critique of phenomenology is valid, but it has an ideological bent of its own. And that ideological bent is something that's not beyond criticism. It's something that can and should be critiqued, and it can't be assumed as the right method to study religion, because it's kind of like protracting a general 19th century bias about what qualifies as the true method and what qualifies as subjective, navel-gazing, normative thinking. That's the general context. Look how we've come full circle in terms of religious studies initially starting as an antagonistic move toward theology, and now in its later stages or current stages, it's kind of reiterating this, but in a different form, given the whole post-structuralist development and what that entails. And now is bringing theology somehow critically back into the conversation, right? It's not that theology ever disappeared, as I've told you guys as we've moved through all of the stages, but it's become more ghettoized in terms of stages 2 and 3 as the predominant way of studying religion. Now, both within and without religious studies recognize that some sort of reflective, critical, ideological work needs to come to the forefront of such a field of study, especially when you're talking about religion. And so theologians and philosophers, who you remember the social scientists kind of left outside as, you know, they're doing valuable work, but it's not empirical, it's not it's not directly related to what an objective academic study of religion is, right? And now it's coming back in the sense, well, at least in the last 20 to 30 years, it's coming back within religious studies. And I think that's really important for us to recognize, that this isn't just a conversation that theologians and philosophers are having outside of religious studies. These are arguments being proposed as a means of reintroducing philosophical and theological, and in my general sense, ideology critique in the study of religion, not just toward an object of study that we call religion or religious behavior or people of a religious orientation, but scholars themselves. I think that's really important. Stage 4, as you remember, I was saying, you remember stages 1 to 3 was very much about trying to formulate an object out there, you know, a real social, political, economically affected reality in the world, right? But it's there. And we're just here observing it and trying to formalize it, trying to think about, well, what is its role and function in society? But comes from that position of neutrality. You know, despite that nobody's ever going to embrace a neutral perspective, it's just the idea that there is this unspoken sensibility that when you're studying religion, you have to leave religion out of it. So it's interesting now, this rethinking theology and a form of philosophy is being brought back into the fray. You see, it's not that we've never thought about religion in the study of religion, but religion is typically seen as an object to be studied, and in the desire for objectivity, we have to have a specific stance with regard to who's calling the shots, who's setting up the rules for the discussion. And that's a delicate issue. And trust me, there's a lot of blowback to some of these suggestions because religious studies is such an old field, and if you're going to connect it with theology and philosophy, there are a lot of deep-rooted problems that people have with this question, especially in the West after we've negotiated our demons of private and public expressions of knowledge. And where religion now is separate from the state, and what would it mean then to include this kind of stuff in a public liberal arts program or social scientific program and stuff. But what you have here is more or less people that are trying to tackle it in the face of a lot of animosity or pushback to, I call it reflective work in the study of religion. And if you read Cooey's piece, you see the kind of intentions at play here. The intentions at play, and I think this came out nicely yesterday in a seminar that I was giving on this specific topic, that in the university, we do inculcate values and we do disseminate values. And if students and scholars are not allowed to broach these questions in the context of the university, they're missing out on a crucial dimension of what it means to be human. And presumably the university is the place where we can do that. But you see, part of the backlash against theology has also been, like, for example, McCutcheon has tried to disassemble the field of religious studies, because the field of religious studies is something that can be managed adequately in an anthropology department, in a sociology department, in a psychology department. And he's right, but with certain aims in view. You know, it can't represent the entire aspect of religious studies. Phenomenologists were trying to point this out, and of course they went to, I think, another extreme in the Iliadian perspective, which was more or less to give us a semblance of being truly academic. And not ideologically invested. I mean, this is what true religious studies entails, looking at religion as sui generis, and then you start to have eidetic visions and give us true ideas of what religion is as an object to be studied in the world, etc., as the sacred. And this opened itself up to the kind of backlash of the new materialists, which were saying, hold on a second. You're talking about centuries of very fruitful analysis of religion that suddenly has become illegitimate because it doesn't represent the religious voice or religiosity, or is somehow outside of that discussion. And then you get this pushback saying, well, that's religion. And we settled this question a long time ago in saying that this belongs outside of the university. In the university, we do objective study. We do neutral, nonpartisan study of religion. And as soon as we let the normative structures of what underlies a lot of religiosities back into the university, then there's going to be lots of problems, because then it seems like people are trying to proselytize. It seems like, you know, it's now, the agenda of a specific religious group. And listen, it can become that. This is the nature of discourse. It can become that. But the question is, one can't exclude it on the basis of its fragility. In the context of this conversation that we've been having this term, for me, the reintroductory of theology, or the questions of theology as an academic contributor, I don't see as being something that can be broached outside of the particular history that we've been looking at. So, for example, if you're a theologian that sees yourself as representative of a specific tradition outside of religious studies, then the specificities of what constitutes theology and religion is going to be addressed very differently from the position of, you know, how we started in comparative religion with Schleiermacher, with the inheritance of the Enlightenment and all of their various perspectives, so that what is trying to be answered from the perspective of people like Devaney, Cooey, and the others that we have there is directly addressed to this audience. If we try to broach those old questions outside of the context of, let's say, the place where religious studies is now in terms of stage 4, then I think we kind of miss an opportunity to open up the broader foundational, moral, philosophical questions that arise from within this tradition, that ought to be critiqued within this tradition. This kind of question about academic theology, or what I call ideology critique, or even what I call philosophy of religious studies, means to provide a space within academia where human beings can raise some fundamental questions in a general way? And how can we get scholars to think about these fundamental human issues without feeling that we have to have some sort of God's eye view on things?